In the mid-19th century, massive changes in Japan were taking place by the Meiji Restoration. Japan needed to settle its internal conflicts and decided to write a formal constitution. The Constitution of Japan, unlike others, gave supreme power to the government and ultimate power to the monarch, or the emperor, who became untouchable by law. This new economy that was run by the government was made to help keep Japan up with its rapid expansion. Prince Ito was to write the constitution, and he gave the ruling party of Japan as much power as they wanted. The emperor, using his power, created a civilian government, and democracy spread rapidly throughout Japan. Japan got a sense of how strong they were as a unified state, and they were sick of being taken advantage of by foreign powers. This feeling of strength was backed up by the victory against China in the Sino-Japanese War in 1895. The war resulted in Japan gaining territory on mainland Asia, a foothold for their soon-to-be expanding empire to run amok. The Japanese faced some pushback from the world powers, who forced them to withdraw from Korea entirely, and withdraw from all of China. Japan wanted to seize their opportunity for imperialism, and thus began a competition with Russia over East Asia. Japan's imperialistic ventures were egged on by a secret society run by some of the highest government officials, like the future Prime Minister of Japan. The society was called the Black Dragon. The Black Dragon Society, or the Kuroyeka, wanted Japan to assert its dominance over Russia by fighting them. They also painted an ill picture of the West through aggressive propaganda strategies, which involved swaying people to their side by sometimes means of force. They also believed that expansion would lead to a more powerful and less corruptible economy. Their influence led to the defeat of Russia in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905. This gave Japan influence in the Manchurian region and usurped entire control of Korea from Russia. Japan got a lot of territory from joining the fight against Germany in World War I, and that led them to gaining an even greater influence in Southeast Asia. The Japanese had been stationing troops in the Manchurian sector to guard their supply lines and railways since 1905, with no conflicts between them and the Chinese troops. But on September 18, 1931, a bomb exploded on the railway and fighting ensued between the Chinese military and the Japanese forces. A small detachment of troops, Japanese troops, led by First Lieutenant Kawamoto Tsurino, was stationed along the railway when the bomb was detonated. According to his account, the Chinese troops were the first to engage in battle when they fired at his battalion. In a matter of minutes, Japanese reinforcements were called, and more than 500 men were at the railway. From the west came more reinforcements of the Japanese, who surprised the Chinese and pushed them back. By 5 o'clock that morning, the Japanese had broken through the south wall of the Chinese barracks, and by 6 a.m. they had control of the entire barracks. The Chinese were forced to retreat to the neighboring village of Erisen, where the Japanese cornered them. Most of the Chinese regiments suffered very few casualties when they were fleeing, but the 620th Regiment was trapped, and only about 20 of the 600 men made it out alive. The attack was led by two high officers in the Japanese military, Colonel Sashiro Igatari and Colonel Kanji Ishara. The attack was supported by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mori Kakua, and by the leader of the Army Special Service Agency, Major Hanaya Tadashi, who had relocated some of his own troops to the railway in anticipation of the Chinese fighting back. The attack had been carefully planned out. Starting in the summer of 1931, a large group of commanding officers of the Japanese military began to develop plans to occupy all of Manchuria by force. Tokyo, the major city at the time, sent its support to finalize the plans in June of 1931. Sure, they had enough backup if the Chinese military devoted all its resources to protecting the Manchurian region. Major Tadashi brokered a deal with Korea. The government of Japan had no idea of these dealings and actually planned to pull all of the Japanese troops stationed in Manchuria out on September 24th. China blamed Japan for this attack and accused them of pursuing a fight to gain territory, which they were. But Japan denied this, saying only a handful of officers were behind the plan and no troops were aware of this situation. China sought help from its allies in the League of Nations, but none were given. The League of Nations report on the incident regarded the crisis as something that both parties had an equal part in executing, while of course China had nothing to do with it. And they said that Japan would withdraw from the Manchuria region as soon as possible, while in fact Japan began to even push farther into the Chinese region and promised nothing to the League of Nations. This lack of action by the League of Nations has been linked to Japan's extreme success in East Asia. After the attack, Japan's civilian government was overthrown peacefully by the military. In February 1932, the government was run solely by the army and became East Asia's first totalitarian-run regime. This let Japan continue its expansion with no overview by any major power. This encouraged countries like Italy and Germany to do the same thing, because Japan had received little to no pushback from other countries or the League of Nations. Japan wanted further expansion to break the deadlock they had just reached in their economy in the summer of 1932. Japan was facing a shortage of raw materials and necessary resources to keep up with their now rapidly expanding population, so they needed more economic territory, again. After the Prime Minister was assassinated in 1934 by right-wing extremists, no one stepped up for his job and democracy was completely gone. This led the military to continue to push into Asia with no oversight. Now at this time, Japan was not a fascist state, just a state that wanted to grow and wanted military rule. In other words, they were disconnected from European politics. Japan got involved with European politics when the Germans allied with Russia in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Japan was scared of Germany, and when Germany annihilated France, Japan got even more frightened. They feared that with the Germans' expansion mentality, they would start to seize control of the weaker Asian colonies, many of which Japan was profiting off of. Germany's occupation in Asia also threatened Japan's massive trade and supply routes with China and other Eastern Asian powers. To add on to this, with the Russians' help, Japan would have been forced to turn over everything they had built in the past 20 years. In September of 1940, Japan signed the Tripartite Pact with Italy and Germany and officially entered onto the Axis side.